Have you ever wondered what would happen if a country just decided to lock its doors and hide the key from the rest of the world for over 200 years? Well, that's pretty much exactly what Japan did during its Edo period. We're going to dive into this incredible experiment, a time when Japan tried to protect its hard-won peace by shutting almost everyone out. But they left one tiny, secret window open. Let's find out why. So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at why Japan felt it had to close its doors in the first place. Then, we'll get into the super strict closed-door policy they came up with. After that, we'll zoom in on the one big exception, that tiny window to the world. We'll explore what life was like inside this bubble, and finally, see how that small opening was actually the key to Japan's entire future.
Just look at this map. I mean, really, look at how empty it is. For more than 2 centuries, these few little lines were Japan's only connection to the outside world. All the trade, all the contact was squeezed through just one port, Nagasaki. Everybody else, locked out. So the big question is, why? Why do something so extreme?
Okay, to get the answer, we have to rewind the clock back to the year 1603. For 100 years before this, Japan was just torn apart by non-stop civil war. A new government, the Tokugawa Shogunate, finally managed to bring peace. But, and this is a big but, holding on to that peace, that was their biggest problem. Now, the person in charge of the whole country was the shogun. You can think of the shogun as the top general, the real boss. Japan did have an emperor, but it was the shogun who had all the actual power. And these new shoguns, well, they were pretty worried.
You know, they looked around at other places in Asia, and they saw European countries moving in and taking over, like what Spain did in the Philippines. They were terrified Japan could be next. They also saw Christianity spreading, which they saw as a foreign influence that could challenge their rule and start more fights. And you know what? Their fears kind of came true. A huge rebellion broke out, and a lot of the rebels were Japanese Christians. For the shoguns, the message was crystal clear. Outsiders were a major threat to the peace they had fought so hard to win.
Okay, let's just pause here for a second. Put yourself in the shogun's shoes. You've just ended 100 years of war. Now you see all these new dangers coming from the outside that could just restart everything. What do? Well, the shogun's answer was extreme.
Their solution was as simple as it was dramatic. They decided to just cut Japan off from the rest of the world. This new rule became known as the closed-door policy, or in Japanese, Sakoku.
Sakoku. The word literally means chained country, and that's exactly what it was. They created a bunch of super strict laws to stop foreigners from coming in, and to stop any Japanese people from leaving Japan. Japan was basically putting itself in lockdown.
And they were not messing around. Get this is a quote from the actual law. It meant that if a Japanese person left the country for any reason at all, they could never, ever come back. If they tried, they would be executed on the spot. This was one of the most intense isolation policies in history.
This timeline really puts it all into perspective. The policy gets started around 1635, and it isn't broken until 1853. That's more than 200 years. Just to give you an idea, that's longer than the United States has even been a country. For generations of Japanese people, this was the only reality they ever knew. But here's the twist. Closed didn't mean it was perfectly sealed.
And this, right here, is where the story gets really fascinating. The shoguns didn't want to be completely blind to what was happening out there. They knew they needed to take a little peek outside. So, while they locked every single door, they decided to leave one tiny window open.
See, this is so important to understand. The goal was never total isolation. It was controlled isolation. The shoguns wanted to be the ones calling the shots, deciding exactly what and who could come in and out. And all of that control was focused on one single spot. And here it is, Dejima. This tiny, fan-shaped island was actually built by people right in the harbor of Nagasaki. It was only connected to the mainland by a single bridge, and you better believe that bridge was heavily guarded. For any European, this little patch of land was the only part of Japan they were ever allowed to set foot on.
So, who got the keys to this window? Well, from Europe, it was only the traders from the Netherlands, the Dutch. The shoguns trusted them, or at least trusted them more than others, because the Dutch seemed to only care about business, not about spreading their religion like the Spanish and Portuguese. Japan also kept trading with China, Korea, and the nearby Ryukyu Kingdom, but each had its own separate, tightly controlled entry point. But the Dutch, they were Japan's only link to the entire Western world.
So what happens when a whole country decides to live inside a bubble for 200 years? Let's take a look at the results of this massive experiment.
The biggest result? Peace. For more than 200 years, Japan didn't have any major wars. After a century of constant fighting, this was an absolutely incredible achievement. The shogun's main goal, to create a stable country, well, it worked.
And this long period of peace led to a boom in culture. With hardly any outside influences, Japanese art became incredibly unique. This was the time of those beautiful ukiyo-e woodblock prints you might have seen, of exciting kabuki theater, and of those short, thoughtful haiku poems. Japan's own culture just grew stronger and deeper.
But was this isolation a good thing or a bad thing? You know, historians don't really agree. For a long time, most people thought Sakoku was a huge mistake that made Japan fall behind the West in science and technology. But now a lot of historians see it differently. They argue that it was actually a really clever strategy that brought peace, saved Japan from being colonized, and allowed it to get ready to modernize on its own terms.
And that idea of preparing for the modern world, that's the final and maybe most important piece of this whole puzzle. And it all comes back to that tiny window at Dejima and what was secretly passing through it.
You see, it wasn't just spices and textiles coming through Dejima. It was knowledge. This had a special name, Rangaku. That's Rangaku, which literally means Dutch learning. A small but dedicated group of Japanese scholars studied Dutch books to learn everything they could about Western science, medicine, and technology.
And if you want proof, just look at what was being imported. Yeah, they brought in some goods, sure, but look at this chart. The single biggest import, making up almost a third of the entire trade, was books. Japan wasn't just importing things, it was importing ideas.
So even during the supposedly closed period, knowledge of Western science in Japan kept on growing. Thanks to Rangaku, these scholars were slowly learning about new discoveries in things like medicine and map-making. They were making sure Japan didn't fall completely behind the curve. And this right here is why it all matters. When American warships led by Commodore Perry showed up in 1853 and forced Japan to open its doors to the world, the country wasn't starting from scratch. Because of those 200 years of Dutch learning, Japan already had a solid foundation of scientific knowledge. And that allowed it to modernize incredibly fast and avoid being taken over like so many of its neighbors.
So we end right back where we started. Was Japan's 200-year isolation a terrible mistake that held the country back? Or was it actually a brilliant strategy that protected its culture and its independence and perfectly set it up for future success? As you can see, there's no easy answer.